Good morning. Good to be back in the Pacific. I was involved in the PESA Plus negotiations for a short amount of time between 2014 and 16, working mostly on services, investment, and movement of people. So I was not there for all of these negotiations, but some of the agreement, in particular the schedules, I was involved in. So it's good to be back. I see only a few familiar faces from that time. So I assume there's been a lot of change in the the teams working on this agreement. And so I think, at least in terms of my involvement in this workshop, an important objective is to go through the agreements, the important chapter and schedules, and to make you familiar with that content and allow you to clarify any kind of doubts you may have. So I think for this aspect of the workshop, it really depends on you, on the questions you may have, and on the interaction, so that we can, to the best of our capacity, try to answer the questions you may have. In terms of my involvement in the program, what we will do now is to have an overview of services trade in terms of its economic relevance. Later on, after that, I will go through some of the key features of the Agreement on Trade and Services at the WTO. And the reason is that a lot of same are also used in a fairly similar way in the context of PESA Plus. So we will go through that, and of course, because it is of direct relevance to PESA Plus, which uses these concepts and also builds on the General Agreement on Trade and Services. Later on, I think tomorrow, I will be involved in some related topics which will focus on the schedules of commitments. Okay, the schedules of commitments in the context of the GATS, but generally in the context of any GATS type agreement, and this was of course an inspiration for PESA Plus. So we will discuss how to read, how to understand a schedule of commitment, and then with Richard we'll go through your own schedules of commitments in PESA Plus, again to make sure that you understand how to read those, and then to see if you have any particular questions, and we will again have a practical exchange on these schedules of commitments. Okay, so this goes for some of my involvement in the workshop. So now let's discuss a bit the key general trends on trade and services. I think trade and services certainly was something very important at the time that PESA Plus was negotiated, but now the importance of this topic has certainly increased even more over the last few years. And not only because of the pandemic, which further highlighted the importance of services trade, but even before then, the dynamism of the sector was really highlighted. And what we have seen over the last few years, and certainly since the chapter was negotiated, is the increasing importance of government measures, trade policies of governments that affect trade and services. And these government measures and the transparency around them, the predictability of these government measures, the openness of these government measures really are an important determinant of the performance of the service sector. Okay, and this is what we have learned. A lot of these things we knew when PESA Plus was negotiated, but with improvements in data, with improvements in data on trade flows, on investment in services, data on services policies, we know a lot more about the impact of these policies on the performance of services sectors that are very important for your economies. What we also have learned over the last few years is the potential of services to really provide for or to really be an important pathway for development. Okay, because a lot of economies are becoming more and more oriented towards services. Services trade is playing an ever important role in the global economy, and services are really a way to increase diversification and to provide for development. And this is starting to attract a bit more attention, and again, a lot more than it did some time back. In terms of services, of course, services now, as we'll see in a second, are providing a lot of, a number of new trade opportunities. There's a number of changes that are taking place in economies, in world trade, that are providing new opportunities, new export opportunities for developing countries in services. But services is also a bit different than goods. And the idea in many cases for trade and services is, of course, to export, take advantage of export opportunities, but it's not only that. It's the, as I said at the beginning, it's the importance of having good policies in place, good trade policies to improve the business climate, improve the investment climate, improve the performance of the sector, because these are products that are used by all sectors of the economy. Okay, so in services, it's not only about exporting services, it's also about importing, it's also about attracting investment in services to grow one's economy and to grow employment in services. Okay. Yeah, how do I do it? Sorry, how do I should have listened more carefully to it. Okay, I hope you can see well enough. What we have seen over the last few years is a growing shift in national economies, in the global economy, towards services, which are really placing services at the center of economic and development strategy. So we're really seeing a transformation, an economic transformation, a structural shift towards services. So what we see in this chart, so I don't know if you can see everything at the back, so I will take you through some of the charts. We see the structure of world trade, okay, between 1970 up to 2020 or so, and in blue we see the growing share of services worldwide in terms of share of total GDP. So we see the share of services increasing over time, accounting for a greater part of the world economy, while the share of industry in agriculture overall are diminishing. And so this share of services in the world economy, in GDP, is also reflected for different levels of development. So services is increasing as a share of, GDP, of output, economic output, for countries at different levels of development. For developed economies, where services account for about 3/4 or so on average of their economies, okay? But also for developing countries, middle income economies and even lower income economies, services is the most important sector compared to manufacturing or compared to agriculture. It is the most important sector in relative terms across all levels of development, and that share has been increasing over time. So overall, services account for about 2/3 of world GDP. Services account for about 2/3 of world or global foreign direct investment. So the importance of the sector is increasing very significantly. It's an ongoing trend. The sector is also generating and accounting for a greater part of employment. It is the sector that is creating most jobs worldwide. So here in this chart we see the structure of employment, okay, different groups of countries around the world. So this is the world average, and in blue we see the share of employment around the world that is linked to services compared to industry and to agriculture. And so we see that the share of services also has been increased. That makes sense, since services are accounting for a greater share of economic activity, and they now account for about 50% of employment worldwide. And so we see that this trend for for countries at different levels of development, high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income countries, we see in blue the share of services increasing over time in all the different groups of level of development. Okay. And of course, what we also see in the chart is that the higher the level of development, the higher the share of services in employment. Okay, but even for low-income economies, the share of services has been increasing. The importance of services, and then we'll see also the importance of policies and trade policies that affect services, also comes from the fact that this sector is very important for women employment in particular. So in terms of the sector contribution to women employment, it is more important than than other sectors, and then also for male employment. It is the most important sector by far for smaller enterprises. Okay, most small enterprises worldwide work in the service sector or involved and active in the service sector, and also a very important sector in terms of employment of youth. So if we look here at your own economies, you would know this more than I do, but using the latest data we could find from the World Bank statistics, World Development Indicators. So we see for some of you the contribution of services, so services value added to GDP. So of course, some of these numbers can be affected by the pandemic, which has kind of, shifted patterns and production patterns around. But for example, Tonga, 50% of their economy is services. Samoa, 70, Solomons, almost 50, Kiribati, 68, and Vanuatu, 60. Okay, so different. The data was available for different years, so depending if it's just before the pandemic or in the middle of it, it has an impact. But you can see that for the level of development of Pacific Islands, services is even more important than on average. And that makes sense because, of course, of the characteristics of the region, of your economies, which doesn't have a large territory for agriculture or for some types of manufacturing. And so services, of course, is even more important for Pacific Islands than it is for other countries at similar levels of development. Okay. Now, we've seen that service, is very important in national economies, worldwide, for employment, for GDP, and this importance has been increasing. Okay. Now, what is then the importance of services in world trade? Well, for a long time we thought that services was not that important in world trade, but now we have different ways to measure the relevance, the significance of services in world trade. I'll take you through some of that. And what this highlights again is that services are really been transforming world trade and play a very important role, not only as a product that is traded, okay, but as a sector that really is essential for trade to take place, okay, to facilitate trade even in other sectors. And the performance of the service sector, which is again affected by different types of government policies, is really key to be able to connect to markets globally, to export agricultural products, manufactured products, to integrate in value chains. You cannot do that if the service sector is not efficient and of quality. These different companies in other sectors need access to efficient services to be able to grow and compete. So services have been really the most dynamic component of world trade, even before, well, especially before the COVID pandemic. So they have grown at a much faster pace, and this is what you see. So for those who cannot see at the back, but this highlights the growth rate since 2005 up to 2022 of services or commercial services compared to goods. And so we see that services exports globally have grown at a faster pace than goods. So this measures trade and services on the basis of balance of payments statistics. So balance of payment statistics would cover for all of your countries. I think you would find this information, and these are the official statistics. And so this is the first way to look at trade and services, to measure trade and services. It does not cover all of what we in the WTO or you in PESA Plus call trade and services, but it covers transactions between residents and non-residents. And so we'll talk later on of the modes of supplying trade and services, but balance of payment statistics essentially cover mode one, so cross-border trade and services, consumption abroad, so tourism, for example, and a little bit of mode four, which is services supplied by natural persons, okay? But it covers a good part of what is trade and services, and these are official statistics that have been there for a long time, which allow to compare over time. And you have this data for all of your countries, and you can track it and look at different subsectors, okay? So we see that it has expanded at a much faster pace than trade in goods. What happened during the pandemic? What do you think happened to trade and services globally, not just here, but globally during the pandemic? You can see from the chart here. But also when you compare to goods, what do you think happened during the pandemic? So let's make this a bit interactive. We're going to be here for 4 days, so we can, and I don't want you to not ask questions, because there are no bad questions. Services, I understand, is not for many of you something you work on day to day, so there's no bad questions. But intuitively, what do you think happened to world trade and services during the pandemic? You know, I mean, from your experience.
What are restrictions? I think we had border restrictions, and then it's not working.
It should be. No,
it's not working. That's okay. I think everybody can hear me. I think we had border restrictions, and then people were asked to remain at home, so working remotely, and a lot of businesses had to adjust to that new working environment. That also affected consumer behavior in terms of consuming different types of services and different types of goods as well, and adjusting to the new way of thinking.
Yeah, but in terms of trade, what happened to trade and services? For those who know, I mean, we haven't discussed yet the different types of, ways of supplying services internationally, and we'll discuss that in a second. But intuitively, when you have transactions between, a service supplier in one country and a consumer, what happens when you have a pandemic? Which sector, sector of services export was most affected by the pandemic?
I would like to comment.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, Samoa's trade and services is dictated by the travel receipts. And once the pandemic hit, this was the first time Samoa's trade and services fell into a deficit.
Yeah.
So, of course, that's
Yeah. So worldwide, we see that there was a big drop in services trade. I think the worst year of the pandemic, it dropped by overall worldwide about 30% of world exports of services fell in just 1 year, -%. A lot more than world trade in goods, because of course people stayed home, but you could still, there was, the ships were still going, thankfully, transport services, so the goods were still being delivered, thanks to some types of services like transport. But a lot of services exports require proximity between the supplier of the service and the consumer, like for tourism. And that was an important part of world trade, and it dropped to almost, close to zero at the worst of times. And so that resulted in a big drop in world services trade. And of course, especially for your economies, which were, but others that were completely closed to movement of tourists during that period. So there was a further drop in services trade, but even despite that, services has grown faster than goods for the period 2005 to 2022. So overall, if we measure services trade worldwide on the basis of balance of payments, we see that it accounts for about now 22% of world trade of goods and services. Okay, it was largely because of the pandemic. Just before, it was about almost a quarter of world trade was trade and services. So since 2005, global exports of services have almost tripled. And this growth of commercial services exports has been, and it may be surprising, but has been even stronger for developing countries. Okay, it has services trade has grown faster than goods trade. And this growth of services export worldwide was stronger for LDCs in blue. So this is the growth rate, okay? Since 2005, services exports of LDCs have grown faster. In gray, it's the other developing countries, also has been growing faster than all the rest, which is essentially the developed economies, okay? So of course, growing faster because it started from a lower base, okay, but growth rate of services, more important for developing countries. LDCs still account overall for a small share of world trade and services, very small, but their services exports then quadrupled over that time period. So something becoming more and more important, and the share of developing countries in services trade has increased in terms of exports, up to about a third of total trade and services. Okay, so the basic point there is services trade is becoming more and more important for developing countries, and developing countries account for a more important share of trade overall. Works? Okay. Okay, now let's look at some additional data in terms of trends. We see that services trade has increased for developing countries. Now, in what sector has this taken place? And what we see is that the expansion of services trade has been really fueled by communication technologies. Okay, of course we know there's tourism that still accounts for an important part of services trade, especially for certain countries. But overall, the general increase and the growth in services trade has really been facilitated by advances in information and communication technologies. Okay? Why? Because a lot of services can now be supplied digitally. They can be more easily supplied remotely. So the cost of, supplying services over telecommunication networks, ICT networks has gone down. So you're allowed to, provide more quantity, more data, more services remotely through these networks to reach more easily people far away. And services are something that can be digitized, that can be supplied over digital networks. Okay? And this trend, this technological change has really, allowed a lot more trade in services to take place. And so what we have seen as a result are, balance of payment statistics. You have three main sectors. You have travel, which is essentially tourism. You have transport of all kind, okay? And then you have the rest, which is other commercial services, which includes, telecommunication, computer services, information services, professional services, all types of services provided to businesses, financial services, and so on. Okay? And we really see that where the most dynamic growth has taken place are in other commercial services, which includes many sectors where you have more digital services. Okay? Most of them are sectors that can be where services are more easily delivered over electronic networks. So if you look at this chart, the little bubbles there show the blue least LDCs. In gray, you have developing countries, and the world average in orange. And you see the growth rate. So where you see, the blue dot or the gray dot is where, more towards this side, it shows that the growth rate for developing countries was the most important. And so we see that developing country exports of services were more important in, telecom, computer and information services, IP services, financial services, insurance services, other commercial services. So all services that can be more readily digitized. So the growth of services and the increasing participation of developing countries is not linked only to the more traditional sectors like transport and travel, but a lot to these, more dynamic sectors. So now I ask you a question. Give me some examples of, services that can be exported digitally or electronically. So services, some types of services that can be exported electronically, remotely. So with the supplier of the service in Samoa, for example, exporting through digital means to Fiji or Australia or some other country. What could it be?
Like music and movies and stuff. Like music and movies and
Yeah, audiovisual services, yes. A growing type of service export, yeah. Which now, it did not used to be very feasible to provide these services over digital networks, but now, with the speed of the networks, it's much easier to do so. Anything else? Frank? Education services, yes. Well, the reality is that now almost every type of service provided digitally, electronically, remotely, okay? So, and that increases the potential for trade to take place, because you don't need, for many sectors, you don't need to have the supplier close to the consumer. You can supply through a digital network. So that can be almost all types of services. All types of professional services, legal services, consulting services of any kind to businesses, computer services, education, even some health services can be provided online, all types of financial services, and so on. So this has really facilitated trade and services. It has really, fueled increased exports of services of other commercial services, which is where developing countries have been particularly successful. Now, this chart I think is interesting because it highlights again the growth of non-traditional. So non-traditional means not transport, not tourism services. The exports of these other commercial services has really helped a lot of developing countries diversify their export baskets. And we see also that these other commercial services are very important for certain countries. And so what this chart does is to look at a number of developing economies, to look at some sectors that are more easily digitized. So ICT, finance, other business services, and then to look at the share of this sector of services exports in the country's total exports of goods and services. And so looking at recent data, we see the top 10 countries in the world where these services sectors, ICT, finance, and business services, account for the greatest share of total trade. So of course, these are, I think all of them, or most of them, small island countries, because a lot of this was during the pandemic, so it kind of changes the picture. Of course, the borders were closed, there was no tourism, so that increased the relative importance of these kinds of digital services export. So we see Bermuda, 60% of their exports in 2022 or so were in these three sectors, okay? But then you have, Samoa, Nauru, Cook Islands, Tuvalu, FSM, okay, top 10 in the world. Of course, it's because the borders were closed in many cases, but still you see that, and because they're not big exporters of goods, and tourism was affected by the pandemic. Still, you see that for a lot of countries, even in normal times, these digital services export, commercial exports account not only for an important share of services trade, but of total trade. Okay, I don't think we need to go to that. Just to highlight, we have in the WTO tried to develop new ways to measure digital trade, to measure digital services trade. And so with this new data, we have measured worldwide the exports of digital services, okay? And what we see is, not surprisingly, that these services have grown at a much faster pace than, all other forms of trade. So faster than all other types of services exports and faster than goods exports. Okay, so that's what I wanted to, some of the key trends I wanted to show you using balance of payments, okay? But services trade is is a bit underestimated when you look only at it through the lens of balance of payments. Can somebody tell me why balance of payments statistics, which you all have for your country, does not fully capture the importance of trade and services as defined in the WTO and the GATS, or as defined in PACER Plus? Anybody has any clue? Which is in that chart, if you can see it. So what are the main ways of, I mean, we'll get into the details of it in the next presentation, but what are the main ways of doing trade and services? There are 4 modes of supplying services, 4 ways to do trade and services, and balance of payments statistics do not capture all of what we call trade and services. Trade and services in the WTO or in PACER Plus is defined as, cross-border trade and services, cross-border supply of services, consumption abroad, like for tourism when the consumer goes abroad, and presence of natural persons. And balance of payment statistics only cover essentially cross-border supply, consumption abroad, tourism, and some of services supplied through natural persons. But it doesn't cover the main means of delivering services internationally. The main way to deliver services is what? Through commercial presence. Okay? And that is not captured, that is not reflected in balance of payments statistics. Okay? So in trade and services chapters or in the GATS, the main way, the economically most important way to do trade and services is through commercial presence. That means, a foreign supplier establishing a presence in a foreign market to provide services through that establishment. So a foreign bank establishing in Samoa to provide banking services. In PACER Plus or in the GATS, that is trade and services. Okay? Even if the supplier is within your country, if it's foreign owned, it's providing services, it's providing trade and services, and that way of providing trade and services is the most important. So when we look at it globally, we look at the importance of different modes of supply, we see that mode 3, services supplied through commercial presence, almost 60% of world trade. Okay? So when we said that trade and services represents 22% or a quarter of world trade, total world trade, that is only looking at modes 1, 2, but the most important one is mode 3, which you have in PACER Plus and in the GATS. Okay? So we have some statistics that are now trying to assess, some estimates that are trying to account for trade and services in all different modes of supply. So we see that this is most important. Of course, it depends it depends on the different sectors. For some sectors, for some countries, the important one remains cross-border supply. But it depends, it varies. For other countries, it is mode 3. It depends on the sector and the country. Now, the other thing I wanted to show, to highlight the importance of trade and services, is to show that the relevance of services as inputs. Okay, so of course we think about tourism services, we think about services that are traded for final consumption, okay? Like tourism. I come to Samoa, I consume hotel services. Or I consume some foreign movies through Netflix or other means as a final consumer. But a lot of trade and services are actually what we can call intermediate services or services inputs. So essentially, services that are imported and then used by companies to produce something else, that go into the production of something else. And so when we look at total trade and services, we see a much bigger part of total trade and services, according to balance of payments, is services inputs that go into the production of something else. Whether to produce goods, you need to use services. If you want to produce, I don't know, any type of good, you need to use financial services, you need to use marketing services, you need to use transport, distribution, telecommunication, computer services to produce something else. And so what that means also is that when you raise the cost of services inputs, then it acts a little bit like a tax on your own production, because it raises most of the services are used to produce something else. So when you import services, most of the time you produce something else. It's an inputs that your companies use. And so if the cost is higher because there are barriers or because there's tax or there is something that raises the cost of these imported services, then it's something more that your companies have to pay, and that makes them less competitive also. So this is a very important aspect and message. And this is why also when you think about services and trade and services, it's not only about, we need to export. Yes, of course, everybody wants to export, but it's very important also in services to the import and the policy regime you have in place to facilitate import of services, investment in services for the benefit of your local companies. And one way to further highlight this, I'll leave you with more information. I think you have access to the slides already on the platform, so you will see more statistics, more information, but just to highlight this general message. So when we look at world trade in terms of value added, so the value of what is actually traded, so we measure it in this way, we see that about 50% of world trade is services value added. Okay, so when we look at the value of what is traded, so when an iPhone is exported, much of the value of an iPhone comes from services. When you produce an iPhone, more than 80% of the value of that product relates to different services that are used in the production. So when we look at the value of what is traded, we see that much of it is services, about 50% of world trade. Again, just to highlight the importance of services going into the production of other things. Or more efficiency, more productivity of these different other economic sectors, whether agriculture or manufacturing. So I don't want to go too much into that, but it's just to highlight that if you look at the value of what is you can see through some of these charts the importance of services value added in manufactured exports. So you see that for different countries, so the first one is Switzerland, so I'll take that example since this is where I live. So more than 40% of the value of the manufactured products that Switzerland exports comes from services. So different services that go into the production of these manufactured products. And again, this highlights the importance of having a policy regime that, caters to services, that facilitates imports of services, that facilitates a domestic economy that has performing services sectors, that can attract investment in services, because that makes your other sectors more competitive. And that helps you trade in those other sectors. If your transport sector is not competitive, for whatever reason, high cost, then it makes it more difficult for all these other sectors that have to buy transport services to produce and export their products. Same thing for financial services, telecom services, sectors that are used as inputs across the whole economy. So we see that there is an important shift towards services and trade, but we also see that despite the growing importance of services in domestic economies, in world trade, in world investment, there's still a lot to do in terms of the policy attention that governments pay to the service sector. Okay, and in terms of trade measures, investment measures concerning services, there's still a lot to be done, because typically, countries think about, we need to foster the manufacturing sector, to promote development. But more and more countries are thinking about, services-led development. But the policy attention in terms of the measures is still not entirely there. Okay. We see that trade costs for services are much higher than for trade in goods. They're twice as high. So this is just estimates that we did at WTO. Trade cost is essentially the difference between services domestically produced and an imported service. How much more it costs to provide a service internationally than it costs to provide it domestically. Okay? So this is the trade cost. And we see that trade costs for services in blue are much higher than for agriculture or for manufacturing. Okay? So the difference between providing a service across border versus providing it within border, the difference is twice as big for services than for goods. Okay? So there's a lot of things that explain that, one of which is the fact that overall barriers to trade and services are still much higher than for goods, and even than in agriculture. I don't want to go too much into detail. We'll discuss these in the coming days, what are barriers to trade and services, but just to summarize, overall, barriers to trade and services, even though they have diminished a little bit over time in recent years, are still fairly significant. Okay, more so in developing countries than developed economies. Some sectors are still protected. So what would be barriers to services? It could be discriminatory measures that discriminate against foreign services or foreign suppliers, barriers to investment in services, monopolies, limits on the number of suppliers, and so on. So these barriers are still significant and can have an impact. What we have seen over recent years is that we have been able to do a bit more research and studies to look at the impact of trade barriers on the performance of services sectors, for example, and we see that those sectors where there are more barriers tend to have higher trade costs, tend to have less performance, less quality service. I mean, it makes sense. Less competition, less performance in terms of the services sector. So we have seen that looking at telecommunication, financial services, and other sectors. And just to conclude, a few observations in terms of what is done in the WTO or in trade agreements, that is, market access commitments, trade and services. And there too, at least at the multilateral level, there's much still to be done, because when you compare to goods, we see that the level of bindings or the level of commitment, not the level of openness, but the number of sectors that are bound, that are subject to some guarantees of access at international level, is still very low. The WTO, about 30% of sectors benefit from some guarantees of access on average. Okay? For developing members, a bit less, 30%. So this, I think, I already covered. Of course, there are some challenges with with services. That explains why it's a bit, despite the economic importance of it, the growing importance in trade, there are some challenges that explain why it's not always receiving the attention that it warrants. Okay? And a lot of that, I think, will become clear as we go through the workshop, and a lot of that has to do with the characteristics of services. A lot of services sectors are very intensive, are very subject to many regulations. So to supply services is not the same thing as producing a chair. The government often needs to establish a lot of regulations, for banks, for telecom suppliers, universal service obligations, for health, for education. So there are sectors that are very intensive in regulations, and that can make, reforms, openness, a bit more difficult or challenging. I mean, it takes more time to open up a sector to competition, in the case of services, than to just lower a tariff, to change a tariff schedule for a particular product. So to open up a service sector, it takes more time. Also, what makes it more challenging is that barriers to trade and services are not typically barriers at the border. Services are typically intangible. They don't go through customs. Okay, they're provided over communication networks, or people moving, or companies establishing in other countries. And the barriers to services trade, the measures that restrict trade and services, are behind the border. They're embedded within your regulatory frameworks. They're part of your laws and regulations. And so you need, when you think about trade and services, measures that affect trade and services, you need to look at all these behind the border measures. You need to look at your regulatory frameworks to identify what is a barrier to trade and services, what is a market access restriction, what is not. What is a legitimate, domestic regulation, what is a trade barrier. So you need to do that work, and it's a bit more challenging. But this is also what we to go through over the workshop. But despite these challenges, I think it is clear now that the importance of having a good business environment for trade and services, having some openness, measures that facilitate trade and services, domestic framework, regulatory frameworks that apply to services that are not overly burdensome, that are trade facilitating, is something very important to grow one's own services sector, to have more performing services sectors, attract more investment and bring different development benefits and also facilitate exports. And trade agreements can assist with that. And we'll go through that later on, but trade agreements can help to identify these measures that are more trade facilitating from those that are more barriers to trade. Trade agreements can bring more transparency to trade and services. They can bring more predictability, so they can help reinforce the business climate for services sectors. Okay, and so we'll go through some of that during the workshop. And my last slide for this first presentation, and we'll come back to that I think throughout the week, but recently we are doing, actually it's not out yet, but we are doing a study on trade and services, a big study with the World Bank to highlight the development benefits of trade and services. And so we identified 6 key general areas for step-up level of technical assistance, capacity building to improve services trade performance, to facilitate services trade. So we'll go through that throughout the workshop, but just to give you a highlight, in addition to commitments and transparency and all that, one of the key issues we found was to address data gaps in services trade. Okay, to improve data, to facilitate data trade, barriers and service, the assessments, and eventually the decisions, the reforms, the commitments that countries make. Increase the participation of developing countries in policy deliberations and services, so to provide the training, the knowledge that would facilitate, greater participation of developing countries in negotiations, in policy discussions, regionally and at a more general level. Helping countries manage the process of market opening while supporting trade facilitating networks, so all kinds of studies to assess regulatory audits, to assess what are the impediments to greater capacity in services, greater export and trade capacity. Strengthening services related regulatory frameworks and institutions, so providing them with the tools to improve the regulatory environment. Assisting developing economies in seizing the opportunities offered by digital trade in services. So there's already ongoing efforts towards that with the World Bank. And I think Australia is contributing to some of that. But this is a key area to assist developing countries to take advantage of the opportunities that arise. And also boosting the skills and capacity of developing economy to supply world markets. So providing skills in terms of business skills, IT skills, to help them take advantage, help suppliers take advantage of the opportunities that are offered there. Okay? So this is what I wanted to highlight in terms of some of the key general trends, underlying trends with respect to services trade before we move to some of the more, specific features in relation to trade agreements. Any questions or comments or at this stage?